Thomas Morrison's boots echoed hollow against the barn floor, a sound that shouldn't exist in a structure built on packed earth and concrete footings. He'd walked across these same planks countless times since he was 5 years old, knew every creak and groan like the rhythm of his own breathing. But this particular section, near the northwest corner, sang a different tune entirely. The crowbar in his hand felt heavier than it should as he knelt down, pressing his ear against the weathered wood his grandfather had laid in 1984, back when the old man's hands were still steady and his eyes could sight a level line without reading glasses. The hollow sound came again when Tom rapped his knuckles against the boards, that unmistakable emptiness that spoke of air and space where there should be nothing but 40 years of settled dirt. He'd been replacing the damaged corner post when he noticed it, the way his weight made the floor flex just slightly, the way dust puffed up from between the planks in a pattern that suggested movement below. His grandfather Samuel had built everything on this property with his own hands, every fence line and water trough, every beam in this barn placed with the precision of a man who understood that shortcuts led to collapse. There were no secrets here. There couldn't be. Tom wedged the crowbar under the first plank and pulled the nails shrieking as they surrendered their 40-year grip. The second board came easier than the third, revealing a rectangle of darkness that dropped away into nothing. Wooden steps descended into that absence of light, their surfaces worn smooth in the centers, where feet had traveled countless times, the edges still sharp and clean. Someone had used these steps regularly, walked them so often the wood had taken on the polish of human contact, but that was impossible. Samuel Morrison had died in 2011, 14 years ago, and Tom had lived alone on this land ever since, the sole heir to 300 acres of Wyoming grassland, and the buildings his grandfather had erected with such meticulous care. The match flared in Tom's hand, sulfur sharp in his nostrils, as he lowered himself through the opening. The flame pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal support beams overhead, walls carved from earth and reinforced with timber, a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of his small circle of light. This wasn't some desperate hole clawed out by someone in panic. This was engineering, the work of a man who understood load-bearing structures and water tables, who had planned for permanence rather than temporary concealment. The match burned down to Tom's fingers, and he lit another, moving deeper into the passage. Fresh footprints marked the dust on the tunnel floor, boot treads, with a traction pattern Tom didn't recognize, certainly not his own well-worn work boots. Someone had been down here within the last few days, walking through this space that Tom hadn't known existed until 3 minutes ago. He was the only person with keys to the barn, the only resident within 5 miles of this property. Yet these prints told a different story entirely. At the edge of his match's glow, shapes emerged from the darkness: a leather chair facing away from the entrance, a wooden table with objects arranged on its surface, belongings positioned as if someone lived down here, maintained a life in this underground room, while Tom slept in the house above. The chair looked expensive, hand-tooled leather with brass tacks along the arms, the kind of furniture that belonged in a study or library rather than a dirt tunnel. Tom circled it slowly, his shadow dancing against the earthen walls. On the table sat a tin cup, still damp with water, condensation beating on the metal. A ceramic plate held crumbs that hadn't yet gathered dust, remnants of a meal eaten within the last day or two. Someone had been living down here, not just visiting or hiding, but maintaining a routine existence in this space beneath Tom's inheritance. Against the far wall, a wool blanket lay folded with military precision on what could only be called a bed, though it was just a wooden platform with a thin mattress. Books stood in careful stacks, their spines showing titles Tom recognized from his own shelves upstairs: histories of the Wyoming Territory, geological surveys from the 1850s, memoirs of frontier life. He picked up the top volume and opened it to the first page. Written in careful script that made his breath catch: property of Samuel Morrison, 1851. His grandfather's name. His grandfather's handwriting, that distinctive slant to the letters that Tom had seen on birthday cards and property deeds his whole life. But Samuel had died 14 years ago, and Tom had gone through every possession in the house above, had cataloged and sorted and kept what mattered, donated what didn't. These books had never been upstairs. They'd been down here the entire time, maintained and read by someone who had access to this tunnel, who knew about Samuel's secret construction project. A metal box sat beneath the table, secured with a simple latch that opened when Tom pressed the mechanism. Inside lay documents that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his family's land. Deeds to properties he'd never heard of, their legal descriptions referencing parcels that didn't match the boundaries Tom had walked and fenced and maintained. Letters addressed to Samuel from people whose names meant nothing, written in formal language that spoke of agreements and obligations and shared interests. At the bottom of the box, a photograph showed three men standing in front of the very barn above Tom's head. But the structure looked different, somehow newer, with outbuildings that no longer existed. One of the men in the photograph was definitely Samuel Morrison, but younger than Tom had ever seen him, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and the lean build of a man who worked with his hands. The other two were strangers dressed in work clothes from a different era, their faces serious as they stared at the camera. Something about their postures suggested alliance, a unified front, men bound together by purpose. Tom turned the photograph over and found writing in his grandfather's hand, undated but clearly old. The agreement holds. The land stays divided. No one speaks of what happened here. SM 1852. Tom stared at those words until his match burned down to his fingers, the pain barely registering. What agreement? What had happened on this land that required such absolute secrecy? Why had Samuel built this elaborate hiding place, this underground room, complete with furniture and personal effects, unless there was something that needed to be concealed, not just from authorities, but from family, from everyone who came after the match went out? And Tom stood in complete darkness, his mind racing through every conversation he'd ever had with his grandfather, searching for clues he'd missed, hints he'd been too young or too trusting to recognize. Samuel had been a good man. Everyone said so. He'd worked this land fairly, paid his debts, helped neighbors when they needed it. He'd taught Tom to measure twice and cut once, to treat animals with respect, to keep his word even when it cost him. But now, standing in a tunnel that shouldn't exist, holding evidence of secrets that spanned decades, Tom wondered if he'd known Samuel Morrison at all. Fresh candle wax marked the table's surface when Tom lit another match, white drippings still soft enough to dent under his thumbnail. Recent ash filled a small metal dish, the kind used for hand-rolled cigarettes, though Samuel had never smoked. Someone had been burning candles down here, lighting cigarettes or small fires, living as if this underground room was their rightful home. But Tom owned this land. He'd inherited it legally when Samuel died, had the deed and the tax records and 14 years of mortgage payments to prove it. No one else had any claim to this property. No one else should even know about this tunnel. The sound of footsteps above his head made Tom freeze completely, every muscle locked tight. Someone was walking across the barn floor, moving with the confident stride of a person who belonged there, who knew exactly where they were going. But Tom lived alone. No neighbors for 5 miles in any direction. No visitors expected, no delivery trucks scheduled, no reason for anyone to be on his property, much less inside his barn, walking across the floor with such deliberate purpose. The footsteps stopped directly over the hidden entrance, the boards creaking under someone's weight. Tom's heart hammered against his ribs as a woman's voice called down through the floorboards, clear and calm, carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty. "You can come up now, Tom. I know you're down there." The use of his name hit him like a physical blow. No one should know he was down here. No one should know about this tunnel. No one should be in his barn without permission, much less calling him by name through the floor. Yet this woman spoke it as if she'd been expecting him to find this place, as if his discovery was part of some larger plan he couldn't yet see. "I'm not going anywhere until you explain what this is." Tom's voice came out steadier than he felt, years of dealing with difficult cattle and broken equipment lending him a calm he didn't possess. "That's exactly what I'm here to do. But I'd rather not have this conversation through a wooden floor. My name is Catherine Bennett. I've been waiting for you to discover that tunnel for 4 months." 4 months. Tom's mind seized on that number, matching it against the fresh footprints, the recent candle wax, the timing that suggested someone had been maintaining this space for exactly that duration. He climbed the wooden steps slowly, each tread protesting under his weight, his eyes adjusting to the late afternoon light filtering through the barn's high windows. When he emerged, he saw a woman about his age standing near the barn's main door, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his face, his posture, his reaction to her presence. She wore traveling clothes, sturdy pants, and a jacket designed for long rides, boots that had seen serious use. A leather satchel hung from her shoulder, the kind historians use for documents, reinforced corners, suggesting it carried something valuable. Her hands rested loosely at her sides. No threat in her stance, but no apology either. She looked like someone who'd made a long journey and intended to see it through to the end. "How do you know my name?" Tom's question came out more aggressive than he'd intended, but the violation of his privacy, the intrusion into his inheritance, demanded answers. "I know a great deal about you, Tom Morrison. I know you inherited this land from your grandfather Samuel. I know you've been living here alone since his death in 2011. I know you've never been down in that tunnel before today, because if you had, we would have had this conversation 4 months ago when I first started monitoring the property." Catherine set her satchel on a hay bale and opened it with practiced efficiency, pulling out a thick folder bound with string. Inside, Tom could see documents, photographs, papers that looked old enough to crumble at a touch. "What I need to know is whether you're ready to learn the truth about what your grandfather really did on this land, what he built his entire life to conceal. My grandfather was an honest man. He worked this land fairly and earned everything he had." The words came automatically defensive, but even as Tom spoke them, he thought about the tunnel below the hidden room, the cryptic message on the back of that photograph. Catherine's expression shifted, sympathy mixing with something harder, a determination that suggested she'd come too far to be turned away by comfortable lies. "Your grandfather was involved in something that affected a lot of people, Tom. Something that was supposed to stay buried forever. But circumstances have changed, and the families involved need to settle this once and for all." She pulled a document from her folder, yellowed paper, protected by a clear plastic sleeve, and handed it to Tom. The handwriting looked identical to what he'd seen on the books downstairs, Samuel Morrison's careful script, dated August 15th, 1851. The content made no sense at first, references to shared ownership and rotation of residents and concealment from territorial authorities. At the bottom, 3 signatures: Samuel Morrison, Thomas Bennett, William Fletcher. "Thomas Bennett was my great-great-grandfather. According to this contract, my family owns 1/3 of the land you've been living on your entire life. We've been honoring the agreement to stay hidden, to let the Morrison family appear as sole owners. But the contract expires in 3 weeks. After that, we reclaim our portion of this property." Tom stared at the document, the words blurring as his world tilted sideways. The land he'd worked for 30 years, the inheritance he'd treasured, the legacy his grandfather had built, all of it suddenly unstable, built on foundations he didn't understand. "This is impossible. I have the deed to this land. It's been in my family since Samuel filed the original claim." "You have one deed, Tom, but there are 2 others hidden in places your grandfather never told you about. And the families who hold those deeds are coming to collect what's rightfully theirs." The sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, hoofbeats and the creak of wagon wheels carrying through the afternoon air. Tom moved to the barn door and saw them coming up the access road, 3 riders with a supply wagon moving at the steady pace of people who knew exactly where they were going. Catherine stepped beside him, her expression tightening. "That's the Fletcher family. They know about today. They've been waiting just as long as I have." The lead rider was a man in his late 50s, weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, sitting his horse with the ease of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. 2 younger men flanked him, clearly related by the similar set of their shoulders, the way they moved in unconscious coordination. They rode into the barnyard and dismounted, the older man approaching with his hand extended, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Tom Morrison, I'm Marcus Fletcher. These are my sons, Daniel and Michael. I expect Catherine has already started explaining the situation." Marcus's handshake was firm, his calluses matching Tom's own, a working man's grip. But there was something else in his eyes, a calculation, an assessment of how Tom might react to what was coming. She mentioned something about a contract from 1851, about shared ownership. Marcus nodded, pulling his own folder from his saddlebag, documents that looked like mirrors of what Catherine carried. "Your grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, William, and Catherine's ancestor, Thomas, they entered into an agreement, a partnership that required absolute secrecy. They built that tunnel system together, took turns maintaining it, protecting what was hidden down there." Tom felt the ground shifting beneath him, everything he'd believed about his inheritance crumbling like dry earth. "You're telling me someone else has been living in that tunnel?" And it wasn't either of you. Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances, something passing between them that suggested they'd discussed this moment, planned for it. I've never been down there in my life. Catherine's voice carried absolute certainty. I only knew about the tunnel because my great-great-grandfather left detailed maps in his papers, diagrams of the entire system. But if someone has been using it, living down there, while we've been waiting for you to find it, then we have a bigger problem than just settling the contract. Marcus's expression shifted to concern, the calculation in his eyes replaced by something closer to alarm. Show me what you found. Tom led them both back down into the tunnel, lighting the lantern Marcus produced from his pack. The fuller light revealed details Tom had missed before, newer candle stubs mixed with old ones, a calendar on the wall marked with dates, a logbook on the table with entries in handwriting that didn't match Samuel's script. Catherine examined the fresh candle wax, the damp cup, her face growing pale in the lantern's glow. This changes everything. Someone knows about the agreement, about the tunnel system, about what's hidden in the deeper chambers. Someone who's been watching, waiting, preparing. She picked up one of the books, opening it to reveal Samuel's signature on the first page, then flipped through to find margin notes in a different hand, entirely observations and questions written by whoever had been living down here. What agreement exactly? Tom's frustration boiled over, his voice sharp in the confined space. What did our ancestors do that was so important it had to be hidden underground for almost 200 years? Catherine's face grew graver, her hand trembling slightly as she set the book down. They found something on this land in 1851, something valuable enough that 3 families agreed to share it secretly rather than let the territorial government claim it. My great-great-grandfather's papers called it the discovery that would change everything. But he never wrote down what it actually was, just that it required absolute concealment, absolute loyalty between the 3 families. The sound of horses grew closer. Multiple riders this time, accompanied by men's voices calling out commands. Tom counted at least 4 different speakers through the tunnel ceiling. Maybe more people moving with purpose across his land. Marcus moved to the tunnel entrance, his sons flanking him, their postures shifting to something defensive. Those aren't my people. Marcus's voice dropped low. I came alone with my sons, just like we planned. Then who are they? Catherine gathered the loose papers from the table, stuffing them back into her satchel with urgent efficiency. Could be someone else who knows about the agreement, someone who's been watching and waiting for all of us to arrive. The footsteps above them multiplied as several people entered the barn, boots striking the floor with deliberate weight. A man's voice boomed through the floorboards, deep and authoritative, carrying the kind of command that comes from money or power or both. Miss Bennett, we know you're here. Your horse is tied outside, still warm from the ride. And Mr. Morrison, we know you found the entrance. There's no point hiding now. Tom, Catherine, and Marcus stood frozen in the lantern light, 3 people who'd thought they understood the situation, suddenly realizing they were players in a much larger game. We need to see what's in that tunnel. The voice continued from above, measured and patient. All of it. Not just the living space, but the back chambers your grandfather sealed off. The contract expires in 3 weeks, and we intend to collect what our family is owed before some lawyer finds a way to extend it or declare it void. Back chambers. Tom turned to Catherine, his whisper urgent. There are more rooms down here. Catherine pointed toward the far end of the tunnel, where the lantern light barely reached shadows pulling in corners that suggested the passage continued. According to my great-great-grandfather's maps, this tunnel extends much further. There should be at least 3 more chambers, all connected, all sealed after the initial discovery was made. They were supposed to be permanently closed, never opened again. A new sound echoed through the tunnel metal, scraping against wood somewhere in a different part of the barn. Marcus grabbed the lantern, moving toward the noise with his sons close behind. Tom followed Catherine at his side, all of them understanding that they were no longer alone in this underground system. Whoever was above them knew about access points the current inheritors didn't have knowledge that suggested they'd been studying this property for a very long time. They're opening another entrance. Catherine's voice was barely audible. They know about entrances, we don't. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by the thud of heavy boots descending wooden steps from a different direction entirely. Tom realized with growing dread that Samuel Morrison hadn't built a simple tunnel, but a complex network, multiple access points in chambers, an underground system that 3 families had maintained in secret for almost 2 centuries. And the people who were descending those steps right now, approaching with lanterns of their own, knew more about this place than Tom had learned in 30 years of living above it. A glow appeared from the far end of the tunnel, lantern light casting long shadows toward them. Three figures emerged from the darkness, the lead figure stepping forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. In the lantern light, Tom saw a woman perhaps 60 years old, silver hair pulled back severely, eyes that held decades of carefully controlled determination. Catherine Bennett. The woman's voice carried satisfaction, as if finding them here confirmed something she'd suspected. And Marcus Fletcher. Right on schedule. Her attention shifted to Tom, and something in her expression suggested she'd been waiting a long time for this moment. You must be Samuel Morrison's grandson. I've been preparing for this meeting for 30 years. Tom stepped forward, every instinct telling him this woman represented something far more complicated than the property dispute he thought he was facing. Who are you? The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just the cold satisfaction of a long campaign finally reaching its conclusion. My name is Sarah Whitman, and I'm here to take back what your grandfather stole from mine. She gestured to the two men flanking her, younger, but clearly there for support rather than intimidation. These are my assistants. They've been helping me document everything in these tunnels for the past 4 months. Every ounce of silver, every piece of evidence, every secret your family's tried to bury. Tom felt ice crystallize in his chest. 4 months, the same timeline Catherine had mentioned. Marcus spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. What are you talking about? What Silver Sarah moved deeper into the chamber, her lantern revealing details in the tunnel walls that Tom had overlooked. Your grandfathers were very clever men. They discovered something on this land that the territorial government would have confiscated immediately. Something worth enough money to support 3 families for generations if managed properly. She walked to a section of the tunnel wall that looked identical to all the others, running her hand along the timber supports until she found what she was looking for. When she pressed against a specific wooden beam, a hidden panel slid aside with a whisper of well-maintained mechanics, revealing an opening that exhaled cool air carrying a metallic scent. Silver ore, a vein running directly under this property that your grandfathers decided to mine in secret. They built this entire tunnel system to extract and hide the silver without filing claims with the territorial authorities. No taxes, no government oversight, no legal complications. Tom stared at the hidden opening, understanding finally washing over him. That's why they needed the secrecy, why they divided the land between 3 families but made it look like one property. Sarah nodded, her expression mixing approval with something darker. Exactly. And for nearly 50 years, that silver has been accumulating in these chambers. Or rather, it was. One of Sarah's assistants spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of nervousness. We should show them now before they waste time searching. Sarah led them through the hidden panel into a chamber that stretched far beyond what Tom had imagined possible beneath his barn. The walls were lined with wooden shelving units, built with the same meticulous care Samuel had brought to everything he constructed, metal containers arranged in precise rows along each shelf, all of them empty. Tools for mining lay scattered across the floor, as if someone had dropped them mid-task and never returned, pickaxes with handles worn smooth from use, hand drills still sharp enough to bite into rock wooden crates that had once held something heavy based on the impressions in the dirt beneath them. Deep gouges in the rock walls showed where silver ore had been systematically extracted over decades, the scars of chisel and hammer visible in the lantern light. Marcus ran his hand along the empty shelves, his fingers trembling with barely controlled rage. 50 years of work, generations of secret mining, all gone. His son spread out through the chamber, examining every corner, searching for some overlooked cache that might salvage the situation. Tom watched them move with practiced efficiency, their familiarity with this space confirming they'd been down here before, though perhaps not recently. These tools look recently used. Tom picked up a pickaxe, testing its weight. The metal head showed no rust despite the underground moisture, and fresh dust coated the handle, the kind that accumulated over days rather than years. That's because someone has been working down here within the last 4 months. Daniel Fletcher, the older son, pointed to fresh tool marks in the walls, places where new support beams had been installed to shore up areas weakened by extraction. The wood was clean pale, showing none of the weathering that marked the original construction. We found evidence of recent digging when we checked the property 4 months ago. Fresh excavation in areas we knew had been sealed. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for and had the equipment to get it out. Catherine knelt and picked up a piece of paper from the floor, partially torn, but still legible. The edges crisp enough to suggest it hadn't been down here long. She held it close to her lantern, squinting at faded handwriting. This is a transport record. Someone was moving large quantities of raw ore. The signature is too smudged to read clearly, but the date is visible. 4 months ago. 4 months. Tom turned to Catherine, watching her face as the same realization struck. That's exactly when you said you started waiting for me to discover the tunnel. When the lawyer contacted you. Marcus moved toward Catherine with sudden intensity, his earlier composure cracking. Very convenient timing, Miss Bennett. You arrive claiming to want your family's share just when the silver disappears. Catherine's face flushed with anger, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I had nothing to do with this. I've been researching my great-great-grandfather's papers for over a year, trying to understand what the contract meant. I only learned about the specific location of this property 4 months ago. From who Tom's question cut through the tension, focusing everyone's attention back to the practical matter of who knew what and when. Catherine hesitated, guilt flickering across her features for just a moment before she answered. A lawyer in town, James Edwards. He said he'd been waiting for the right time to contact the Morrison family about some old business arrangements, that he'd been holding documents from my great-great-grandfather since 1851. He had an office above the general store in Millfield, legitimate letterhead professional references. Everything checked out. Marcus and his sons exchanged meaningful glances, some silent communication passing between them that made Tom's instincts scream warnings. What was this lawyer's name again? Edwards. James Edwards. He had an entire practice files dating back decades, a secretary who scheduled my appointments. Why Tom felt reality reorganizing itself around facts he should have questioned hours ago. There's no lawyer named Edwards in Millfield. I know everyone in that town, every business owner, every professional. The office above the general store has been empty for 5 years, ever since old Murphy died and his family couldn't sell the practice. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of lantern flames and the distant drip of underground water. Catherine's face went pale, her eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from realizing you've been manipulated by an expert. That's impossible. I met with him 3 times. We signed papers. He had documents with original seals, photographs of my great-great-grandfather I'd never seen before. He knew things about my family history that weren't in any public record. Marcus's voice when he spoke carried deadly calm, the kind that comes from understanding exactly how badly you have been outmaneuvered. Someone has been playing all 3 of our families against each other. Someone who knew about the silver, knew about the contract, knew exactly when it would expire. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression mixing anger with grudging respect. Someone who wanted us to discover the theft together so we'd suspect each other instead of looking for the real culprit. Sarah stepped forward into the fuller lantern light, her expression carrying the weight of decades of preparation finally reaching fruition. You're absolutely right, Mr. Fletcher. Someone our grandfathers trusted. Someone they betrayed so thoroughly that it took me 30 years to piece together what really happened, here to find proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. Marcus stepped protectively in front of his sons, positioning himself between them and Sarah. What are you talking about? Sarah pulled a worn leather journal from her coat, its pages protected by careful handling, but clearly ancient, the leather cover darkened with age and use. My grandfather was James Whitman, the man who discovered this silver vein in 1851. The man your grandfathers murdered and buried somewhere on this property so they could steal his claim and build their fortunes on his grave. Tom felt the blood drain from his face, his legs suddenly unsteady. The woman's words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, but too terrible to fully accept. That's impossible. My grandfather was an honest man. He wouldn't murder anyone. Your grandfather, Samuel Morrison, didn't pull the trigger, Mr. Morrison. Sarah's voice carried absolute certainty, the kind that comes from years of research and documentation. But he helped conceal the crime, helped divide the stolen property, and spent his entire life profiting from murder. Along with Thomas Bennett and William Fletcher. James came to them as partners, showed them the silver he'd found, asked for their help in properly establishing a legal claim. Instead, they killed him and divided his discovery among themselves. She opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon, her voice steady as she read aloud words written nearly 2 centuries ago. They have agreed to meet me at dawn to discuss the partnership contracts. Samuel suggested we finalize everything in the tunnel system he has been building, away from any witnesses who might complicate the legal filings. I pray I am wrong about my suspicions, but I fear I will not see another sunrise. If something happens to me, let this journal stand as testimony to what these men have done. Catherine grabbed Tom's arm, her face pale with horror, her grip tight enough to bruise. The sealed chambers. What if they weren't just for storing silver? What if there's another reason they built this entire system, why they needed it to stay hidden forever? Sarah's expression grew grim, her eyes reflecting something that looked like vindication mixed with sorrow. The back chamber contains more than empty shelves, Miss Bennett. I found my grandfather's remains 4 months ago along with evidence of how he died. Your grandfathers didn't just steal from him. They executed him and built this entire operation on top of his grave. Marcus's voice barely rose above a whisper, all his earlier authority stripped away by the implications of Sarah's accusation. How do you know all this? How did you find evidence after almost 200 years? Because I've spent 3 decades tracking down every document, every witness account, every piece of evidence that proved what happened here. Sarah moved deeper into the chamber, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. She gestured to the empty shelves, the scattered tools, the evidence of recent excavation. When I finally had enough proof, when I could prove beyond any doubt that James Whitman had filed the original claim to this land before any of your ancestors, I decided to take back what was stolen from my family. Every ounce of silver that came out of this mine belonged to James. I simply collected what was rightfully mine. Tom understood the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished, the patience and planning required to pull off this kind of operation. You created the fake lawyer. You manipulated all of us into coming here at the same time. You wanted us to see that the silver was gone to fight among ourselves. I wanted you to see the truth with your own eyes. Sarah's voice carried no apology, just iron determination. I wanted you to understand that everything your family's built was founded on murder and theft. That every dollar you inherited, every acre you farmed, every building you maintained was paid for with my grandfather's blood. The silver is gone. Tom spoke the words flatly, accepting the reality even as part of him still struggled to process the magnitude of what he was learning. Yes, and it was never yours to begin with. Where is it now? Marcus's question carried more curiosity than anger, as if he'd moved past rage into some kind of numb acceptance. Being used to build schools and hospitals in towns where my grandfather's real descendants live. Towns in Idaho where the Whitman name means something other than victim, where children can learn in buildings that honor his memory rather than forget his existence. Tom stared at Sarah, feeling everything he'd believed about his family collapsing around him like a structure with its foundation removed. Show us. The words came out quiet but firm, carrying a weight that made everyone in the chamber turn to look at him. Tom met Sarah's eyes, seeing decades of accumulated pain and determination looking back. Show us the proof, not the journal, not the documents. Show us where James Whitman died. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, measuring something in his expression, judging whether he was ready for what she was about to reveal. Finally, she nodded. Follow me. She led them deeper into the tunnel system, past the mining chamber, into areas Tom hadn't known existed. The passage narrowed the ceiling, lowering, and until even Tom had to duck his head, the lantern light casting grotesque shadows against walls that showed no signs of recent use. This was old construction, original work, from when the tunnel was first excavated, untouched for decades until Sarah had found it 4 months ago. They entered a chamber smaller than the others, roughly circular, with a carefully constructed, false wall that Sarah had already dismantled. Behind where that wall had stood lay skeletal remains arranged with disturbing precision, positioned as if the body had been laid out with care rather than dumped in panic. Personal effects surrounded the skeleton, a silver crucifix on a chain, a leather pouch containing mining tools sized for sampling rather than serious excavation, and a pistol that looked like it had been placed there deliberately rather than falling from the victim's hand. Most damning of all was the bullet hole in the back of the skull, a perfect circle that told a story of execution rather than confrontation. James Whitman had been shot from behind while examining something murdered without warning by people he'd trusted enough to turn his back on. Sarah's voice when she spoke carried no triumph, just weary vindication. James Whitman was shot from behind while he was examining the very silver vein he had discovered. Your grandfathers murdered him here and built their empire on top of his grave, sealing this chamber so thoroughly that it took me 6 months of research and 3 months of careful excavation to find it. Marcus Fletcher had gone completely silent, his face ashen in the lantern light. His son stood behind him, clearly struggling to process what they were learning about their family legacy, about the foundation their entire lives had been built upon. Catherine knelt beside the remains, her voice shaking when she finally spoke. All these years, we thought our grandfathers were pioneers, honest men who built something from nothing, who earned their prosperity through hard work and smart decisions. Instead, they were killers who got away with murder for almost 2 centuries. The question now is what you intend to do with this knowledge. Sarah's gaze swept across all of them, measuring their reactions, judging whether they would try to fight her claim or accept the horrible truth. I've taken back the silver that belonged to my grandfather's family. But this land, these buildings, this property, technically it should all belong to James's descendants as well. The original claim was his. Everything that came after was built on stolen ground. Tom looked around the chamber with completely different eyes now. This wasn't his grandfather's clever hiding place. This was a tomb, a monument to greed and betrayal. Every board Samuel had nailed, every stone he'd placed had been positioned to conceal evidence of murder. I can't live here anymore. The words surprised Tom even as he spoke them, but once said they felt absolutely right, the only possible response to what he'd learned. I can't work land that was stolen from a dead man. I can't sleep in a house that was built with blood money, knowing that every meal I eat, every breath I take, is paid for by my grandfather's crime. Marcus found his voice finally, though it came out strained and uncertain. What are you saying? I'm saying that Sarah is right. This property doesn't belong to any of us. It belongs to James Whitman's real descendants, and we need to find them. We need to make this right, even if it's almost 200 years too late. Sarah's expression softened slightly, some of the anger in her eyes fading to something closer to respect. That's an honorable position, Mr. Morrison. But James's only child died young before the murder. His wife remarried and moved back east, started a new life with a new family. I'm the closest thing to direct family he has left, descended from his younger brother, who never knew what happened here, who spent his whole life wondering why James disappeared. Tom made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Then it belongs to you. The house, the barn, the land, all 300 acres. I'll sign over the deed and find somewhere else to start over. Somewhere I can build something that's actually mine earned honestly rather than inherited through murder. Tom, no. Catherine's protest came swift and urgent, her hand on his arm trying to hold him back from a decision she thought was rash. You can't just give up everything you've ever known. This is your home. You've worked this land for 30 years. Everything I've ever known was a lie. Tom's voice came out firm, carrying conviction he felt growing stronger with each word. I won't build my life on a foundation of murder. I won't profit from stolen land or sleep peacefully over an unmarked grave. I won't become complicit in my grandfather's crime by accepting what he stole and pretending it's mine. Sarah studied Tom's face carefully, her expression unreadable. You understand that walking away from this property means giving up considerable wealth. This land is valuable beyond just the silver. 300 acres in Wyoming, with water rights and mineral claims, represents a fortune most people never see. Tom met her gaze without flinching. I understand that keeping it means becoming part of the crime, and I refuse to do that. I refuse to let Samuel Morrison's murder of James Whitman continue poisoning lives 200 years after it happened. Catherine turned to Marcus and his sons, her expression shifting to something determined. Tom's right. We can't keep this land knowing how it was acquired. My great-great-grandfather was part of a murder conspiracy, and I won't profit from that. I'm willing to sign over any claim the Bennett family might have. Marcus looked at his sons, some silent conversation passing between them in glances and subtle shifts of posture. Daniel and Michael both nodded, their decision made. The Fletcher family will sign over our claim as well. My sons and I talked about this possibility before we came here today, what we would do if the stories about James Whitman turned out to be true. We agreed that we couldn't keep wealth built on murder, couldn't sleep at night, knowing our prosperity came from someone else's grave. Sarah's eyes glistened with what might have been tears, though her voice remained steady. James would have wanted his discovery to bring people together, not tear them apart. Maybe now it finally can. Maybe his death can mean something other than just another unsolved frontier murder. Tom felt something lifting from him, a burden he hadn't fully recognized until this moment of release. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of preserving his grandfather's legacy without understanding what that legacy truly represented. Now he understood the heaviness hadn't been responsibility, but inherited guilt, a secret that had poisoned every generation whether they knew it or not. What happens now? Catherine's question was practical, focused on the mechanics of unwinding 2 centuries of deception. Now we make it legal. Sarah pulled papers from her coat documents that looked freshly prepared legal language, typed on official letterhead. I took the liberty of having transfer papers drawn up just in case you prove to be honorable people. If you're serious about this, we can begin the process today. 3 days passed before Tom could bring himself to enter the barn again. He spent those 72 hours sorting through the house, boxing up belongings that suddenly felt contaminated by their origin, trying to separate what he'd earned through his own labor from what had been purchased with his grandfather's blood money. The line proved impossible to draw. Everything in this house, from the foundation stones to the roof shingles, had been paid for with silver extracted from beneath James Whitman's unmarked grave. Sheriff Davis arrived on the 4th day, his patrol car kicking up dust as it rolled down the access road. Tom had been expecting this visit since Sarah had mentioned filing the transfer papers, had prepared himself for questions about why he was giving away prime Wyoming ranch land to a woman he'd known for less than a week. The sheriff was a practical man, suspicious of anything that deviated from normal patterns of human behavior. Involuntary poverty definitely qualified as abnormal. The older man climbed out of his vehicle slowly, his arthritic knees protesting the movement. He'd been sheriff for 30 years, had known Samuel Morrison personally, had attended his funeral, and offered condolences to Tom with genuine sadness. Now he approached the house with the careful neutrality of someone who suspected a crime but hoped to be proven wrong. Tom, I got a call from the county clerk's office. They wanted me to verify that you're of sound mind before they process these transfer papers. Said you're signing over 300 acres to someone named Sarah Whitman. Tom met him on the porch, not inviting him inside, keeping this conversation in the open air, where secrets couldn't hide. I am, and I'm completely sane. Sarah Whitman is the rightful owner of this land, always has been. The sheriff's expression shifted to confusion mixed with concern. Your grandfather acquired this property legally when he bought it from his father in 1952. For that, it was part of the original homestead his grandfather filed back in the 1880s. I've seen the chain of title myself. There's clear documentation going back decades. The original claim was filed by James Whitman in 1851. My great-great-grandfather and 2 others murdered him and falsified their deeds afterward. Everything that came after was built on that crime. Tom watched the sheriff's face, carefully seeing disbelief war with the knowledge that Tom Morrison wasn't prone to dramatic statements or false accusations. That's a serious allegation. You have proof there's a body in the tunnel system under my barn. Skeletal remains with a bullet hole in the back of the skull, personal effects that identify him as James Whitman, and documentation showing he filed the original silver claim to this property before any of our ancestors. The sheriff sat down heavily on the porch steps, his hand moving to the radio on his belt before dropping away. Jesus, Tom, you're talking about opening a murder investigation that's almost 200 years old. You understand what that means. The state archaeologists will have to get involved. Forensics? Probably historians from the university. This property will be tied up in legal proceedings for years. Good. Let them investigate. Let them document exactly what my grandfather's family did. Let them put James Whitman's name in the history books instead of leaving him as an unmarked grave under a barn. The sheriff studied Tom's face, searching for something. You're serious about this, about giving up everything. I'm serious about not building my life on murder, about not pretending that inheritance makes theft legitimate or that time makes crime acceptable. Sarah Whitman filed formal notice with the county this morning. She's claiming the silver mining operation was run illegally for decades, that the ore extracted belonged to James Whitman's estate. She's got documentation that's going to embarrass a lot of people, including families that have been considered pillars of the community for generations. Then let them be embarrassed. Let them face the truth about where their money came from. The sheriff stood up, his joints cracking, his expression mixing respect with something that looked like pity. I need to see this body, and I need to secure the scene until forensics can get here. You understand that means sealing off your barn probably for weeks. Tom felt relief wash through him, validation that he'd made the right choice even if it meant disrupting his entire life. Seal whatever you need to. I won't be here much longer anyway. The forensics team arrived the next morning, 3 specialists from the state crime lab accompanied by a university archaeologist who looked far too excited about examining a 2-century-old murder victim. Tom watched them descend into the tunnel with their equipment, their cameras and measuring devices and evidence bags, turning his grandfather's secret into documented fact that would be preserved in official records. Catherine appeared that afternoon driving a truck loaded with her own belongings, everything she owned packed into boxes and secured under a tarp. She'd spent the last 3 days settling her affairs, closing out a research position at a historical society, saying goodbye to a life that suddenly felt built on foundations she couldn't trust. She parked beside Tom's truck and climbed out, her face showing the same exhausted determination he felt. I talked to my mother, told her everything about what Thomas Bennett did about the murder and the theft. She didn't want to believe it at first, tried to argue that it was just frontier justice or self-defense or something that made it less horrible. Catherine's voice carried the strain of that conversation, the weight of destroying someone's illusions about their family history. But then I showed her the copies of the documents, the photographs of James Whitman's remains that Sarah provided. She couldn't deny it anymore. She cried for 2 hours, then she wrote a check to Sarah for $50,000. Said it wouldn't bring James back, but maybe it could help build something good from all this destruction. Tom felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that they weren't alone in trying to make this right. That's more than Sarah asked for. My mother said it was less than the Bennett family owed. She's selling the family house in Vermont, donating the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in James Whitman's name. She wants his story told properly, wants young people to know that justice matters even when it comes late. The archaeologist emerged from the tunnel as the sun was setting, her face flushed with the kind of excitement that only academics feel when confronting historical significance. She approached Tom and Catherine with barely contained enthusiasm. This is remarkable. The preservation is extraordinary. We can document everything from the manner of death to the approximate time based on the clothing and personal effects. This is going to rewrite what we know about frontier mining operations and territorial violence. Tom felt disconnected from her excitement, unable to share enthusiasm for what was essentially his grandfather's crime scene. What happens to the remains? We'll transport them to the university for full analysis. But once we've documented everything, Sarah Whitman has legal authority as next of kin to claim them for burial. She's already making arrangements with a cemetery in Boise, says she wants James buried near where his brother settled after the Civil War. The archaeologist pulled out a tablet, showing them photographs she'd taken underground. There's something else you should know. We found evidence of more recent activity in the sealed chambers. Someone spent considerable time down there over the last 4 months, not just moving the silver, but documenting everything. There are photographs pinned to the walls, copies of the journal entries, a complete timeline of the murder conspiracy. Whoever took the silver wanted to make sure the truth would come out eventually. That was Sarah. She knew we'd find it all once we started looking. She wanted us to understand exactly what our grandfathers had done. Catherine's voice carried a mixture of anger and respect for Sarah's thoroughness. The archaeologist nodded, her expression turning more serious. There's also evidence that suggests Samuel Morrison knew about the murder. We found a letter tucked into one of the support beams written by him in 1995, addressed to whoever discovered the tunnel after his death. He confesses to maintaining the secret to continuing the mining operation, even though he knew it was founded on murder. He says he tried to make it right by sending money to what he thought were James Whitman's descendants, but he could never bring himself to come forward publicly. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the last of his illusions about his grandfather crumble to dust. Samuel had known, had carried that knowledge for his entire life, had tried to assuage his guilt with money but couldn't find the courage to actually confess. Did the letter say why he kept the secret? Fear, shame, worry about what it would do to his family's reputation. The same reasons people always keep terrible secrets. He convinced himself that since he didn't commit the murder, he wasn't really guilty. But the letter makes it clear he understood that made him complicit. Marcus Fletcher arrived the next day, his sons in tow, all 3 of them, carrying themselves with the defeated posture of men who'd lost something fundamental. They found Tom and Catherine sorting through barn equipment, separating tools Tom had bought with his own money from those that had belonged to Samuel. We went through our family's papers, found records of the mining operation going back to 1851, including distribution schedules, showing how the silver was divided between the three families. My great-great-grandfather kept meticulous accounts documenting every ounce extracted, every dollar earned. He even noted when they had to stop mining for a while because the territorial marshal was asking too many questions. Marcus handed Tom a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers and dates. There's an entry from 1852. It lists a payment to someone identified only as J.W. Widow for $200. Then nothing after that. I think William Fletcher tried to pay off James Whitman's wife to buy her silence or her cooperation in the cover-up. Catherine examined the ledger, her historian's training taking over despite the personal pain the information caused. $200 in 1852 would have been substantial money. Enough to start over somewhere else, especially for a widow with no other options. They probably told her James had died in an accident, gave her money to relocate, and she never knew the truth about what happened to him. That's what Sarah found when she traced her family history. James Whitman's wife remarried within a year, moved to Ohio with her new husband. She died in 1890 without ever knowing that James had been murdered rather than disappeared. Sarah only discovered the truth because her branch of the family kept James's journal, passed it down through generations as a curiosity without understanding its significance. Daniel Fletcher spoke up, his voice carrying the strain of recent revelations. We're selling our ranch in Montana. Dad and Michael and I talked it over. We can't keep property that was purchased with blood money, even if we didn't know the source at the time. We're donating half the proceeds to the scholarship fund. Catherine's mother started using the other half to establish a foundation that helps solve cold cases from the frontier era. Tom felt something like kinship with these men who'd made the same impossible choice he had, who'd valued conscience over comfort. That's more than anyone could ask for. Marcus's expression hardened with determination. It's less than we owe. My great-great-grandfather helped murder a man and profited from that crime for the rest of his life. Every Fletcher who came after him benefited from that murder. We can't undo what was done, but we can refuse to keep profiting from it. We can choose to be better than the men who gave us our names. The county prosecutor arrived that afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who looked at the situation with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd seen every kind of legal complication. She set up in Tom's kitchen, spreading documents across the table, building a case file that would determine how the state handled a murder that predated statehood itself. The forensic analysis confirms that the remains are approximately 175 years old, plus or minus 10 years. The bullet hole is consistent with a large caliber pistol of the type common in the 1850s. The personal effects match descriptions in James Whitman's journal. We have enough to officially classify this as a homicide. Tom poured coffee for everyone, the domestic normalcy of the action at odds with the conversation. But the perpetrators are dead. There's no one to prosecute. The prosecutor accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. True, but there are civil remedies we need to consider. The silver extracted from this mine over the last 175 years represents substantial value. The state has an interest in recovering taxes that should have been paid. Sarah Whitman has a claim to the mineral rights that were stolen from her ancestor. And there are 3 families who benefited financially from an illegal mining operation. Catherine leaned forward, her expression intent. How much are we talking about? The prosecutor pulled out a calculator, running numbers with the efficiency of someone who'd done similar calculations many times. Conservative estimates based on the mining records Marcus Fletcher provided suggest at least 50,000 ounces of silver were extracted over the years. At historical prices adjusted for inflation, we're looking at somewhere between $5 and $10 million in total value. The state's tax claim alone could be over $1 million. Tom felt the number hit him like a physical blow. $1 million debts to the state, civil liability to Sarah Whitman's estate, the complete destruction of any financial security the Morrison, Bennett, or Fletcher families might have thought they possessed. None of us have that kind of money. Even selling all our properties wouldn't come close. The prosecutor's expression softened slightly. I'm aware, which is why the state is willing to negotiate. Sarah Whitman has indicated she doesn't want to bankrupt 3 families to satisfy a debt their ancestors incurred. She's proposed a settlement that would involve transferring the properties to her ownership, establishing the scholarship fund, and having everyone sign agreements acknowledging what happened and committing to making the truth public. Marcus spoke up, his voice gruff with emotion. That's more generous than we deserve, maybe. But Sarah Whitman seems more interested in justice than revenge. She wants James's story told, his name cleared, and his descendants, however distant, acknowledged. She's willing to forgive the debts in exchange for truth. Catherine's hand found Tom's under the table, her grip tight with shared understanding of what they were being offered, a way out that didn't require complete financial ruin, but did require absolute honesty about their family's crimes. We accept. All of us. Whatever Sarah wants, whatever makes this right, we'll do it. The prosecutor made notes on her legal pad, her pen scratching across the paper with finality. I'll draw up the agreements. We'll need everyone to sign, including any other living descendants of the original 3 families who might have claims. This needs to be comprehensive, so there are no legal challenges later. Tom thought about cousins he barely knew, distant relatives who'd inherited some small piece of Samuel Morrison's estate, who would now have to acknowledge that their inheritance was founded on murder. How long will this take? Legally, probably 3 months to get all the documentation in order. Locate all the potential claimants, file the necessary paperwork with the county and state. Practically the rest of your lives. This isn't the kind of thing you sign papers about and forget. This is going to define how people remember your families for generations. Good. Let it define us. Let people know that when we discovered the truth, we chose to make it right rather than continuing the lie. Tom's words came out with more force than he'd intended, but he meant every syllable. Sarah Whitman appeared at the property 1 week later, accompanied by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to record the transfer ceremony for a project about historical injustices and modern reconciliation. Tom stood with Catherine and Marcus as cameras captured them signing the final papers that transferred ownership of 3 separate properties to Sarah's name, officially ending 175 years of illegal occupation. The filmmaker asked them to speak on camera about why they'd made this choice. Tom went first, standing in front of the barn his grandfather had built to conceal a crime. My name is Thomas Morrison. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, participated in the murder of James Whitman in 1851 and spent the rest of his life profiting from that crime. Every generation of Morrisons after him, including my grandfather and my father, benefited from stolen land and illegal mining. I didn't know the truth until a week ago, but now that I do, I can't keep what wasn't ours to begin with. Some things matter more than money or land or family legacy. Doing the right thing even when it costs everything, that's what matters. Catherine spoke next, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Thomas Bennett was my great-great-grandfather. He helped murder James Whitman and helped steal his discovery. I was raised to be proud of my family's pioneering spirit, their ability to build prosperity from nothing. Now I know they built it from blood. I'm signing over any claim to this land because I refuse to profit from murder. I refuse to let silence make me complicit in a crime I didn't commit, but would perpetuate by accepting its benefits. Marcus Fletcher's statement was brief, but carried weight that filled the silence after. William Fletcher was a murderer and a thief. I carry his name and his blood, but I don't have to carry his guilt. My sons and I are walking away from everything his crime built because we choose to be judged by our actions rather than our inheritance. We choose conscience over comfort. Sarah Whitman spoke last, standing near the barn entrance with the Wyoming landscape spreading out behind her. James Whitman discovered silver on this land in 1851. He was murdered for that discovery by men he considered friends. For 175 years, his name was forgotten, while theirs prospered. Today, we're correcting that injustice. Not because it brings James back or undoes the harm, but because truth matters. Because how we respond to historical crimes defines who we are as people. These families could have fought to keep what their ancestors stole. Instead, they chose honor. That choice doesn't erase the crime, but it offers something the original perpetrators never gave: an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a genuine attempt to make amends. The ceremony concluded with Sarah announcing her plans for the properties. The Morrison land would be donated to a conservation trust that would maintain it as natural habitat while allowing public access for education about frontier history. The Fletcher Ranch would become a center for genealogical research, helping other families uncover their true histories. The Bennett property in Vermont would be sold to fund the scholarship program Catherine's mother had started. Tom packed his truck that night, loading everything he owned that hadn't come from his grandfather's estate. It fit in the bed with room to spare tools. He'd purchased himself clothes he'd bought with money earned from odd jobs during college. A few books that had been gifts from friends rather than inheritance. Everything else, including the furniture in the house and the equipment in the barn, technically belonged to Sarah now, part of the estate she'd reclaimed. Catherine's truck was similarly sparse, her life reduced to what she could honestly claim as solely hers. They planned to drive to Colorado, had jobs lined up at a ranch near Durango that needed seasonal help, and didn't care about family history, just work ethic and honest dealing. Sarah found them doing a final check of the house, making sure they hadn't left anything behind that might later prove awkward to reclaim. You don't have to leave immediately. I'm not moving here for another month, not until the legal transfer is completely finalized. You could stay, save up some money before you start over. Tom shook his head, the offer generous but impossible to accept. Every day I stay here is another day I'm living in a house built with blood money. I need to go. Need to start building something that's actually mine. The sun was setting when Tom and Catherine finally pulled away from the property, their trucks loaded with everything they owned in the world. Tom watched in his rearview mirror as the barn grew smaller, the place where James Whitman had died and been buried, the structure that had hidden that crime for 175 years. He felt no nostalgia, no longing for what he was leaving behind. Just relief, pure and simple, that he was driving away from a legacy built on blood. Catherine's truck pulled alongside his at the property entrance, her window rolling down. Where to first, Colorado? Durango. New names, new lives, new start. Catherine nodded, understanding implicit in her expression. We're free of it now, free of the guilt and the secrets and the weight of what they did. Whatever we build from here belongs to us, good or bad. Tom pulled out onto the highway, pointing his truck west toward mountains he'd never seen, toward work he hadn't yet done, toward a future unwritten and therefore full of possibility. In the rearview mirror, Wyoming spread out behind him, beautiful and terrible, the land where his family had built prosperity on murder and maintained it through silence. 2 months later, On stood in a ranch yard outside Durango, mucking out stables for a man who knew nothing about the Morrison family history and cared only that Tom showed up on time and did honest work. Catherine was teaching history at a community college, helping students understand that the past wasn't simple narratives of heroes and villains, but complicated stories of people making choices that echoed through generations. They'd rented a small house on the edge of town, furnished it with belongings they'd purchased with their own wages, built a life that belonged to them, rather than being inherited from people they'd never known. Tom's hands were calloused from work he'd chosen his savings account, held money he'd earned honestly. And when he laid his head down at night, he slept without the weight of unacknowledged crimes pressing on his conscience. Sarah Whitman sent occasional updates. The scholarship fund had awarded its first grants, helping 3 students from Idaho study mining engineering in James Whitman's name. The Conservation Trust had opened the Morrison property to the public with interpretive signs explaining the true history of the land and the murder that had been concealed there. The documentary had premiered at a film festival, winning awards for its unflinching examination of how modern Americans grappled with inherited guilt. Marcus Fletcher and his sons had established the Cold Case Foundation, using their settlement with the state to fund investigations into other frontier murders that had never been solved. They'd already helped close 2 cases from the 1860s, giving families closure they'd sought for over a century. Catherine's mother visited them in Colorado, spending a week hiking mountains and talking about everything except the Bennett family history. On her last night over dinner in their small house, she finally brought it up. I've been thinking about what Thomas Bennett did, about whether his crime taints everything that came after everyone who descended from him. And I've decided it doesn't. His choices were his. Our choices are ours. You and Catherine chose to do the right thing when you learned the truth. That's what defines you, not what some man did 175 years ago. Tom appreciated the sentiment, even if he couldn't fully accept it. His crime made everything else possible. Every opportunity I had, every advantage came from that initial theft. I can't separate myself from that completely. No, but you can refuse to perpetuate it. You can build something honest going forward. That's all anyone can do, acknowledge the past truthfully and choose better for the future. Later that night, Catherine found Tom on the porch, staring at stars that looked different than they had in Wyoming. Sharper, somehow less burdened by history. We did the right thing. Giving up the land, telling the truth, starting over. It was the right thing. Tom squeezed her hand, finding comfort in the certainty of her words, even if he couldn't quite share it completely. It was the only thing, the only choice I could live with. Whether it was right or just the least wrong option, I guess history will decide. The night settled around them, stars wheeling overhead in patterns unchanged by human drama mountains, standing witness to struggles that barely registered against geological time. Somewhere in Wyoming, James Whitman rested in consecrated ground with a headstone bearing his name and the truth about his death. Somewhere in 3 different states, families were adjusting to life after confession, rebuilding identities not founded on historical crimes. And here in Colorado, Tom Morrison was learning what it meant to build a life from nothing to earn, rather than inherit, to choose honor over comfort every single day. It was harder than anything he'd ever done, waking up each morning and choosing to be honest, choosing to live with consequences rather than hide from them. But it was his choice, his life, his chance to prove that people could be better than their ancestors, could break cycles rather than perpetuate them. Justice delayed was still justice, even if it came 175 years late and couldn't undo the original harm. Truth told was still truth, even if it destroyed comfortable lies and forced painful reckonings. And redemption, if it existed at all, had to start with acknowledgement, with saying clearly and publicly, this was wrong, and I will not continue it. Tom Morrison had said those words and meant them, had given up everything to prove he meant them. And now, standing on a porch in Colorado with a woman who'd made the same impossible choice, he understood that some inheritances were worth refusing, some legacies worth walking away from, some prices worth paying to live with yourself in the mirror each morning. The past was written, the future was still unfolding, and in the space between, people made choices that mattered.